Ich bin hier im E-Werk. Hier hat das Kultursymposium Weimar 2016 und 2019 stattgefunden. Aus diesem Waggon haben DJs die Kopfhörer der Menschen im Hof beschallt. Sie haben die ganze Nacht getanzt. Dieses Jahr gibt es leider keine Partys, dafür kommt der Stream aber direkt zu euch. Hier sind ein paar Highlights, auf die ich mich besonders freue. Mit dem Historiker Rüdger Bregmann, dem Zukunftsforscher Björn Theis und der Designerin Julia Watson sprechen wir über die Zukunft im Jahr 2099 auf dem Kultursymposium Weimar. Das läuft vom 16. bis zum 17. Juni. Und wir sprechen über die Welt, in der die Enkel und Ururenkel leben werden. Und der Astrophysiker Avi Loeb von der Harvard-Universität, der wird uns erklären, warum wir vielleicht nie lebende Außerirdische treffen werden, aber in den Tiefen des Universums vielleicht irgendwann die Überreste längst erloschener galaktischer Zivilisationen finden werden. Die 93-jährige Sexualtherapeutin Ruth Westheimer wird uns dann schließlich verraten, wie sich die Erwartungen an Sexualität und Beziehungen im Laufe der Generation verändert haben und welche Werte und Wünsche anscheinend generationenübergreifend immerwährende Gültigkeit besitzen. Heute gibt es aber erstmal die Premiere des letzten Beitrags aus dem Vorprogramm, also bevor kommende Woche dann das Kultursymposium Weimar wirklich losgeht. Wir blicken nach New York. Die KollegInnen dort vom Goethe-Institut haben Stimmen versammelt, wie die indische Schriftstellerin Megha Majumdar, die äthiopisch-amerikanische Autorin und Fotografin Maaza Mengiste, den deutsch-libanesischen Romanautoren und Poetry-Slammer Pierre Jarawan. Und in einer Diskussionsrunde mit der Moderatorin Tess Lewis sprechen sie über den Roman, sprechen über Traumata in der Literatur und über Narrative der Vergangenheit. Alle Beiträge aus dem Vorprogramm der vergangenen Woche findet ihr auch in unserer Mediathek. Die wird in den kommenden Wochen immer weiter wachsen. Es lohnt sich also immer wieder da reinzuschauen. Und wer nicht genug von Literatur bekommen kann, es gibt noch eine zweite Diskussionsrunde zum Generationenroman. Und da treffen die Autorinnen Anja Kampmann und Nadja Owusu aufeinander. Beide eint auch in ihren neuen Romanen die Suche und das Nachspüren nach Themen wie Erbe und Verlust, Erinnerung und Identität. Jetzt freue ich mich aber erstmal auf den nächsten Beitrag und dann, dass es nächste Woche endlich losgeht mit dem Kultursymposium Weimar. Und ich hoffe, ihr seid zahlreich dabei im Livestream auf der Website des Kultursymposiums. Bis dann. Tschüss.
Good evening to those of you watching in Germany, and greetings to our international audience in various time zones throughout the world. Thank you for joining us, and welcome to this event, Trauma's Field of Distortion, which is being streamed as part of Kultursymposium Weimar's introductory program. My name is Tess Lewis, and I'm the curator and moderator for this event, which was co-organized by the Goethe-Institut New York. The theme of this year's Kultursymposium Weimar is generations, and our event will explore how identity and memory shape the stories generations tell each other and themselves through the prisms of three profound, challenging novels. Pierre Jarawan's The Storyteller, translated by Sinead Crow and Rachel McNichol, Megha Majumdar's A Burning, and Maaza Mengiste's The Shadow King. These three novels all address the way traumatic history is transmitted, actively or passively, from generation to generation, and they examine the distorting effects trauma and shame exert on individual and collective identities. Our time today is very short, so I won't read the panelists' biographies. I encourage you to find them on the Kultursymposium's website. They will each read a short passage from their novels, followed by a brief discussion, and we'll conclude with a broader discussion. Megha, perhaps we could begin with you. A Burning follows the fate of Jivan, a young Muslim girl in the slums of Calcutta who witnesses a terrorist attack and writes a post on Facebook critical of the government. Because of this post, she's accused of collaborating with the terrorist and is instrumentalized by a far-right regional political party in their rise to power. A former gym teacher, P.T. Sir, who had previously taken her under his wing, now sees her predicament as an opportunity to advance in politics. And that starts a chain of events which doesn't end well for most of the characters anyway. So perhaps you could read a short passage to give us a sense of your style in the novel and the atmosphere.
Sure, thank you so much, Tess. It's such an honor to be here alongside you and Maaza and Pierre, so I'm very happy to do this. I'll read the passage that you suggested, which starts on page 272. And this section is PT Sir, the gym teacher that you referred to. It's his section, so I'll just read a few paragraphs. One morning begins with a red sun, light that slips around the curtain and finds his eyes, and it is the same as all other mornings, except it is wholly different. It is PT Sir's first day as an education secretary in the government. PT Sir lingers for as long as he can bear it at home, then dashes to his new office. The city is wide awake. Flocks of schoolgirls, some holding hands, cross the street before his car. Their ironed and pleated skirts, their big laughs, tug at who he used to be. A boy scrubs dishes with ash in the gutter before a street-side booth hawking noodles. A stray dog trots along, no longer able to bother the man in his car. Before the metal detector gates of the state government building, turbaned guards salute PT Sir. He wonders whether they know who he is, or whether they salute anybody who arrives in a government-issue white ambassador. One of the guards shows him to an elevator designed for use by VIPs only. In the rising compartment, heart drumming, PT Sir inspects his face in the shined metal doors. He may run into all sorts of VIPs in this building, from lobbyists to industrialists to movie stars. All have been known to discreetly visit this building. On the 7th floor corridor, PT Sir walks by a cleaning lady sitting on the pads of her feet, pushing a wet rag in wide arcs. She does not even glance up as he passes by. PT Sir unlocks the door to his new office with a brand new key. Inside, there's a tiny room, windowless. PT Sir closes the door behind him and sits in a chair with a high leather back. The chair tilts pleasingly under his weight. It rolls too, on wheels that do not get stuck. PT Sir sits like that for a few minutes, now and then tapping his fingers on the expanse of polished wood before him. Aside from a desktop computer and, puzzlingly, a packet of pencils, there's nothing else on the desk. The newness of it pleases him. Perhaps I'll stop there if that's okay.
Okay, sure. This passage is followed by a phone call he makes to a journalist where he suggests that maybe the mercy petition that might get Jivan's sentence reduced or get her out of jail needs to be channeled somewhere else. And the journalist finds himself co-opted without necessarily even agreeing to it or even knowing what he's agreeing to. And one of the primary forces in this novel, in the distortion field around trauma, is shame, particularly the profound cost of both resistance and moral compromise in the face of political violence. This reporter has gone to the prison and interviewed Jivan and finds his story being changed by his editor. He finds himself under pressure by this political upstart. The instinct to whitewash the price paid in conflict, whether we pay it in our own lives or at the mercy of others, is a powerful one. And PT Sir is not the only actor whose ambitions depend on Jivan's destruction. There's also an aspiring actor, Nhidra Lovely, who could offer evidence in support of her. But everyone does their own moral calculus for various motivations, again, shame being one of them. So Megha, how did you think about the power of shame in your characters' lives when you were constructing this work?
That's a great question, Tess. You know, shame operates in different ways in the lives of these characters. P.T. Sir, the gym teacher, he was somebody who supported the central character who's now in prison, but he started turning against her because of the sense that she was not adequately grateful to him. He felt jilted by her, and that, you know, the kernel of that is the shame. How dare she reject me? And then shame operates in other ways too, like the other character you mentioned, Lovely, who, you know, is marginalized in complex ways, is shamed by those around her, is told that she has a certain station in society and her dream of being a movie star is too big. It's not for her. But she turns that shame back on people every day on the streets by teasing them, by joking with them. When they're trying to put her down, she puts that shame back on them. So I found these two modes of shame turning into anger and shame turning into humor really interesting.
Mm-hmm. And the shame turned into humor is the least destructive. It's almost creative, even though it's still a dynamic of shame. It is far gentler than the other option. Mm-hmm. One thing that this novel illustrates very well is the way individual views, perspectives, contrary views, marginalized views can, if listened to, complicate the dominant narratives. So how conscious a choice was this multiplicity for you while writing?
I think the book's ambition when I started working on it was to ask, when there is this rise of hatred-filled right-wing nationalist ideology, how do people who are caught within that rise, how do they dream of something that is not just survival, but bigger than survival? How do they look for meaning within this system, which thwarts generosity, thwarts justice, which pushes people into these moral positions where either I succeed or you have justice? We can't have both. You know, what does it do to their moral centers? So I was very conscious of how are these characters manipulated by the systems and institutions that they are caught within, but also within that, what are the ways in which they push back? What are the ways in which their ambitions become the site of seeking something greater?
Mm-hmm. This dynamic between the individual and being marginalized and finding a cause outside themselves is an important theme in your book as well, Maaza. And so I'd like to turn to The Shadow King, which recounts the Italo-Ethiopian War through the experiences of women soldiers and most centrally Hirut, who is an orphan and domestic servant and whose only possession is an old rifle given to her by her father. And this becomes, you know, an important object in her dedication to a bigger cause. She's the one who notices a peasant's resemblance to Haile Selassie, Ethiopia's emperor, who has fled the conflict to England. And this peasant is given one of the emperor's uniforms, and he serves as a role model, or as his role is to inspire the troops as a shadow king. Another important figure in the novel, who's both central and marginalized, is Ettore, an Italian soldier who's Jewish, so his situation is precarious, and he's charged with creating a photographic record of Colonel Ficelli's accomplishments. And because most of these accomplishments are truly evil, Ettore realizes that he's become, as you put it, an archivist of obscenities and a collector of terror. But interestingly, these photographs also serve as a kind of resistance, as an act of bearing witness to the cruelties committed by his countrymen. He was tasked by his father to remember, to record what goes on, knowing his father had lived through the pogroms in Eastern Europe, knowing how easily conflict can escalate. And so these photographs bear witness to cruelty, but they also become a pivot with which to challenge orthodoxy and accepted histories. So perhaps you could read from the book and give us a sense of your style, of the role photographs play, and how you approach your characters.
Yes, thank you for that, Tess. And it is really a pleasure to be here, Megha and Pierre, and get a chance to talk with all of you. This is a section from the book. This is one of Ettore's photographs, and a particular boy that Ettore is photographing. Photo. A boy in a stained shirt rests his cheek against a tall boulder as if it were a father's chest. He stares at the camera, doe-eyed and curious, his lips folded around a mouthful of food, a stream of words, a cry for help, a burst of laughter. One palm balances against the hard surface of stone, his finger raised and pointed ahead, the gesture an accusation and a plea for patience. His small heels dip over the plateau's edge. His broad toes cling desperately to earth. What expands behind him is majestic and stupefying, a vast landscape of tall mountains and merciless rocks, a gaping ravine that drops out of view, breathtaking even in this frozen glimpse. His face, a blur of tender features, the shaking head moving faster than shutter speed, swinging left, then right, then left again in defiance and horror. What cannot be captured, that he repeats his name until that final free fall. Zarihun, Zarihun, Zarihun. And the ricochet of his voice is the earth's mournful lament, land tempering its cruelty. They say their names and demand to know his. They drag themselves toward the threshold and collapse to the ground in mindless laughter. Light wavers around their sluggish figures, unsteady bodies sinking into haze. Ettore leans in, arches close, orders Ascari to keep them still, but it is impossible to get a steady shot. The last push is desperate. It is a plea for normalcy, a return to control and command. The prisoners tip over the edge with soft bones, relieved and graceless, and all Ettore can photograph are awkward figures buckling into empty space, shouting their names into a gulf that multiplies their voices, a repetitive, deafening chorus. They spill over the edge as if gliding underwater, drowning and surging up for air, spinning between a rapturous dream and a paralyzing nightmare. Ghastly shapes of unspeakable words, dark marks against the sky. And then I will read one more passage. When Ettore meets Hirut, who was a soldier fighting against the Italians, someone whom he photographed also, and they're meeting 40 years after the war. Then when Ettore walks into the station with his shoulders slightly raised from the memory of a camera he was wise not to bring with him, Hirut stands. For a moment, she has to feel her dress to make sure it is on, that she is not naked before him, shaking in loathing and humiliation, as Fucelli orders, again, Soldato, take another picture. Hirut straightens. She lifts her chin and stares at Ettore as he pauses and looks at her, recognition and shame rippling through light and shadow to shrink the space between them. And when he takes a step in her direction, nervous and bewildered, Hirut salutes. He pauses, nearly stumbles, and between them the valley expands and gunpowder rises in the breeze to choke them both. But he keeps moving forward as if he has been expecting this, as if he has prepared himself for this moment, has been getting ready for it since the last time they faced each other on the battlefield. Ettore walks toward her as if the path to forgiveness lay between them, as if the years erase scars and photographs and history, as if that hand stretching out to grasp Piruts can raise the dead and return all he has stolen. He expects pity. This much she can see through the haze of old battles and the unearthly silence. He expects the years not to have hardened her fury. He expects to walk toward her as if he has never worn a uniform, as if he did not mold himself to fit its contours. Here is the truth he wants to ignore, that what is forged into memory tucks itself into bone and muscle. It will always be there, and it will follow us to the grave. I'll stop there.
That's a wonderful passage. And the image of memory being tucked into bone and flesh is very striking. And it's a counterweight to the way memory is preserved in photographs. But what you do so marvelously well is you implement the destabilizing force of photographs into your narratives. For example, in the excerpt you just read, the boy's lips are folded around a mouthful of food, a stream of words, a cry for help, a burst of laughter, all of these and none. It's, a picture can tell 1,000 words. It can also tell 1,000 stories. When I was preparing for this event, I was translating a series of poems by an Austrian poet the series was inspired by old photographs of Vienna. And I was struck by these lines in connection to The Shadow King. The report of moments arrayed in pictures that tell a fleeting story, yet conceal everything that actually happened. And that's the sense I got reading The Shadow King, is everything is revealed and everything is concealed. And could you talk a bit about what photographs reveal and conceal in your understanding of history?
Yes, thank you for that, Tess. I'd love to know who the author is too when we get done with this. That's a really wonderful quote. In looking at photographs that soldiers took in Ethiopia, photographs that they chose to bring back with them, I realized that these were mementos, in a sense to curate their memory, and a way to help them remember those things that they wanted to remember. They wanted to remember themselves in a very particular way, and they would not take other photographs so that they could, I think, forget that aspect. And I wondered about the ways that the way they chose to preserve certain memories of themselves could actually reveal something else they didn't intend. Because I, as an Ethiopian looking at it, would be more aware of the history than let's say the families that they took these photographs back to. And I wondered about the way that the people who were photographed, who were often East Africans, Ethiopians, might have left clues in those images that someone like me, generations later, could look at and recognize something unspoken that might rest even outside of the frame. And I wanted to look at images as a distortion of an actual event, because those images that power makes is really supposed to reflect back the power that's holding the camera, whoever that is. And I began to look at these images that the soldiers took as self-portraits, regardless of whatever it was that they were photographing, whether it was an East African or whether it was a building or what, any of that. And that revealed a lot to me about the kinds of memories that were being curated that would then become called history, because history is a curation of events by whoever it is that's doing that gathering. And what I found again and again, and which is reflected in that scene that I wrote, is that Ethiopians who were being photographed, East Africans, I was even looking at some photographs from Libya, there were moments of resistance. And if you knew how to look, you could see that people would suddenly move right when the camera's going so that the face would be blurred, or they would suddenly just turn a certain way. And I would see these again and again and begin to understand what was actually happening.
That's fascinating, the idea of approaching these photographs as self-portraits. Another element along with the photographs that has an almost talismanic power in your novel, which we saw in this excerpt, are names. The Ethiopian prisoners, as we heard, repeat their names before they're executed. And one character, known as the cook, refused to reveal her true name when she was forced into slavery. And throughout the whole novel, she conceals it. She never gives it up. And finally, Hirut, in I think an absolutely devastating scene, tells Kidane, who has repeatedly raped her and humiliated her, she nevertheless reveres as a commander. When he's dying on the battlefield, she cradles him in her arms and tells him, "Your name will be forgotten, but mine will be remembered," knowing that that is not true. But it was such a devastating kind of vengeance. There's so much in the book that made my blood run cold, but this did particularly well. So talk about your names and what they signify for you in the context of the Shadow King.
Names, I think in most cultures are really significant. My last name, my surname is my father's first name. And if I know his second name, surname, I know his father's first name. And this is how we learn generations of our family. My mother keeps her father's name, even in marriage, after marriage. So I know her lineage. Coming to the United States, understanding that I carried that history with me, it was part of who I am. Every time someone speaks my name, they speak my family. Was important, especially as a little African kid who went into a place that had no idea how to deal with her. It was important. And I know that names ground so many different cultures in a particular, not just country, but a particular place within that country. And I wanted to reflect that in my characters. When they say their names as they're being killed, they are forcing the Italians to recognize what is actually being taken. The cook recognizes or understands the power of a name, but because she has been stolen from her family and enslaved, the name is the one thing she will not give. So everyone, including me, calls her the cook. She didn't reveal it, throughout the book. I discovered it much later in the writing process.
But you still didn't give it up, which is
right.
I think the only option, truly.
Yeah.
Pierre, names are complicated in your book. Your characters adopt identities for various reasons, expediency and strategy and necessity, and also photographs. In The Storyteller, the narrator, Samir, is haunted by a photograph of his missing father. Samir's parents fled Lebanon for Germany in 1983. Samir was born in Germany, but his father's Lebanon, which no longer existed by the time Samir was conscious, but it existed for Samir. It dominates his life and his imagination. Samir's father disappears without warning when he's 8 years old, and Samir finds himself unable to get on with his life as an adult until he can find some kind of closure, find his father, or find out about him. And only after a long search does he find that the photograph, which has been so definitive for him, has more than one story to tell. So perhaps you could read a passage and we'll speak about the novel and names and stories for you.
Yeah, thank you, Tess, and thank you to both of Megha and Maaza to read from your novels. I really loved hearing that. Before I read my passage, may I add something about photography and memory, because it says something very interesting about this topic when you talk about Lebanon, because at some point in the Lebanese Civil War in the 80s, there were no chemicals left for families to develop their films or to bring them somewhere to get the film developed. So what they did and what journalists also did was they took a picture. They always had a notebook with them, and then they wrote, frame number 1, for example, and they wrote into their notebook, frame number 1, for example, kitchen table, a cake on the table, 4 candles, a birthday, and I love that because somehow it's you remember the photograph you just took, and by trying to capture it into words, you're already changing history, right? Because a memory is unreliable, and by you're not just looking at the picture and describe it, but you remember the moment, and you write down what happened instead of seeing, and this is already where history is being changed, by talking about it, and this is, for me, it's a metaphor about how history is dealt with in Lebanon and many other countries, of course, as well. But yeah, and that's why the photograph in my book is somehow important as well, because it's in the description of the picture, basically everything is there, but as a reader, we look at the wrong details, and that's why we are misled for the rest of the story. But let me read it. It's a story from a passage from where the family is in the living room, and the father of Samir is showing pictures of Lebanon to the family, or to Samir especially, who has never seen Lebanon by his own eyes. And then, he has already shown some pictures, and then the following happens. Looking back, I think he just picked up the wrong slide in his excitement, because he wasn't watching what he was doing. My guess is he meant to pick the one next to it. The slide he actually showed us, he had been moved to the back of the bunch on purpose. He had filtered it out so that it wouldn't end up in the projector, so that we wouldn't get to see it. The projector rattled. My mother glanced at the photo, looked away, then back again suddenly, as if she had to convince herself it was really there. At the right-hand edge of the image stood my father beside a good-looking young man with thick black hair, dark brown eyes, and engaging smile. They were posing beneath a chandelier in a large foyer, a white carpeted staircase with a gilt banister behind them. The man beside father was wearing a uniform and had a gun tucked into his belt. There was a cedar stitched onto the left breast of his shirt, a cedar with a red circle around it. Next, I studied father. He was very young and seemed almost shy. The look in his eyes, today I'd describe it as dreamy, didn't quite match the rest of the scene. Father was smiling a dreamy smile and saluting. He was wearing the same uniform as the other man, and he too had a gun tucked into his belt. There are moments when you think about asking a question but decide not to. Your antennae sense a barrier. Your intuition tells you it's not the right time for that question. But years later, when you know more than you did then, you regret. You regret not asking the question. The one question that might have explained everything. Why he was wearing a uniform, for example. Why he had a gun. Who the man was beside him. It would have made things so much easier. Father stared at the picture as if he didn't recognize himself. There he was on our living room wall, large as life, standing beside a man who looked as if his uniform was a second skin, as if he'd been wearing it his whole life. I can only speculate now what thoughts went through Father's mind in that moment, what feelings the slide must have triggered, what memories, what pain even. We all stared at the picture. Nobody said a word for what seemed like an eternity. Then my sister began to squirm and cry on my lap. Mother snapped out of her stunned silence and took the wriggling bundle from me. She left the room, rocking the baby in her arms. Father turned off the projector and slid out of the room with his head bowed. I stayed behind. A second earlier, I'd wanted to ask him the story behind that picture. Now I'd decided not to.
There is a story behind the picture for Samir, and it changes, the story changes as he gets different facts and perspectives. In The Storyteller, you have two sons searching for their father's legacy in newspapers, eyewitness accounts, documents that are not part of the official history. And in fact, you have a group of university students putting themselves in great danger by creating an alternate archive of suppressed information. And so when you were researching for this novel and thinking about how to present it, how did you balance conflicting historical accounts to tell your story?
Yeah, I mean, in the description of this event, there's a quote by Walter Benjamin that, history is being made by the victors, but what he obviously has never been to Lebanon because, there was no victors. Of course, the poet is older than, but the conflict in Lebanon ended without, there was no victors who could have written history. So that means what you have in Lebanon is 18 different versions of history, because you have 18 different religious groups coexisting in this tiny country. And so you have 18 different stories, basically, of guilt and innocence, of experiences of violence, and the question in which society you are raised or you are born into, it basically defines what kind of understanding of history you grow up with, because there will always be the others, and you will always be belonging to the one who's innocent, to the only one who's innocent, of course, and all the others. But this goes for 18 different religions. So it was very difficult to have this, to put all this together and to give an image that is free from opinion, but basically that is kind of, it describes the chaos. And I think that's what was the most authentic thing, is to make to the reader experience the chaos of this aftermath of the war. And I think what also helped was the distance, me growing up in Germany and not having been part of this and not having experienced all of this. But looking at it from the perspective of a writer and from someone who wants to know more, and this really helped me to remain, at least a bit distant. And because I think, the medieval cartographers, when they drew their maps, they wrote a sentence into that part of the maps. They were, that nobody had ever been there. And they wrote "Hic sunt leones" in Latin, which means "here are lions," to say that this is a potentially dangerous part of the map. And this describes my writing approach, I think. I love to open up new territories for myself, and I'd like to go where the lions possibly live, and this means, to open up territory for myself by doing the research, by having to do the research, and by doing that, learning a lot about myself and also the country my parents come from, but also opening up to the readers a new territory, which is in this case Lebanon, to in the first case German audience, but then through the translations, into English and French and Spanish and so on, it's basically people anywhere can read it. So I think, this was my approach.
Well, I think "Hic sunt leones" could be written on the cover of any of these novels. There's I think, dangerous territory in each of them. Is your novel published in Lebanon?
it's published in Lebanon, but not in Arabic. So they read it in English and French, and it hasn't been translated to Arabic yet.
And what kind of response did it get? How did the Lebanese readers react to it? Did they see you as an interloper in their history, or as shedding a light on? Yeah,
more the last, because I mean, it's not, unfortunately, it's not, you know, a country of many bookstores and a vivid publishing scene. So I think if you are a reader in Lebanon, you already are educated or open-minded, and not so much, you know, so you don't stick to your perspective. So when I get feedback from readers in Lebanon, they are thankful that I, you know, mentioned these themes in my novel, and they think that it's important to talk about the past, which doesn't happen, and so yeah.
Maaza, I imagine that the novel for Ethiopian readers is a wonderful affirmative experience, and I know the Italian translation was just published. How was it received in Italy? I know Fucelli is based on a historical figure, correct?
He's a composite of several figures that I know of. The Italians, it's what I get repeatedly, that this is an uncomfortable history for Italians to confront or read, even in fiction. Most Italians don't know this history. It was not taught in history books, or it might have had one or two lines. And so I think the responses have been overwhelmingly positive for right now. But I always think with a book, it takes time for the opposition to really wake up and hear about what's being written. So Italy is moving further right in their government. You know, there's still a pretty strong fascist population there. There's been a lot of education and pushback against that, but I'm curious to see what will happen as the book continues to live, because it was just published. I'm not sure what will happen, but it's been really positive right now, and I've been really grateful.
Yes, it will be interesting to see as it gets more notice and is read more. I'm sure it will touch more nerves. And Megha, inevitably, a burning touches any number of nerves in India at the moment. Have you gotten a response from Indian readers?
I have to say I haven't been following it very closely. I've just kind of let the book have its own life. I have heard from people, you know, that they've enjoyed it, that they found it provocative in an interesting way. I'm sure there are people who didn't like it, which is great. But, you know, if there are readers who are there in Kolkata, where I grew up, who see the reality of the city around them in this book, if it helps them to think or question their own beliefs or what they read in the news, even a little bit, I'll be very happy.
Yes, and I imagine that the type of opposition whose toes it would step on are not likely to pick up this kind of novel. It's so exhilarating to read these novels that both affirm an understanding, a critical understanding of history, and push back against things that are taken for granted. Unfortunately, our time for this segment is almost up. Thank you to the audience watching us live. There will be an additional 15-minute segment available for later viewing in the Mediathek on the Kultursymposium Weimar's website. And so I encourage you to follow the conversation with us there if you are able. So thank you very much for joining us.